Law himself, the magician whose wand had wrought so surprising a change, shared, of course, in the general prosperity. His wife and daughter were courted by the highest nobility, and their alliance sought by the heirs of ducal and princely houses. He bought two splendid estates in different parts of France and entered into a negotiation with the family of the Duc de Sully for the purchase of the Marquisate of Rosny. His religion being an obstacle to his advancement, the regent promised, if he would publicly conform to the Catholic faith, to make him Comptroller General of the Finances. Law, who had no more real religion than any other professed gambler, readily agreed and was confirmed by the Abbé de Tencin in the Cathedral of Melun, in presence of a great crowd of spectators. On the following day he was elected honorary churchwarden of the parish of Saint Roch, upon which occasion he made it a present of the sum of 500,000 livres. His charities, always magnificent, were not always so ostentatious. He gave away great sums privately, and no tale of real distress ever reached his ears in vain. At this time he was by far the most influential person of the state. The Duke of Orleans had so much confidence in his sagacity and the success of his plans that he always consulted him upon every matter of moment. He was by no means unduly elevated by his prosperity, but remained the same simple, affable, sensible man that he had shown himself in adversity. His gallantry, which was always delightful to the fair objects of it, was of a nature so kind, so gentlemanly, and so respectful that not even a lover could have taken offense at it. If upon any occasion he showed any symptoms of haughtiness, it was to the cringing nobles who lavished their adulation upon him, till it became fulsome. He often took pleasure in seeing how long he could make them dance attendance upon him for a single favor. To such of his own countrymen as by chance visited Paris and sought an interview with him, he was, on the contrary, all politeness and attention. When Archibald Campbell, Earl of Islay, and afterwards Duke of Argyll, called upon him in the Place Vendôme, he had to pass through an antechamber crowded with persons of the first distinction, all anxious to see the great financier and have their names put down as first on the list of some new subscription. Law himself was quietly sitting in his library writing a letter to the gardener at his paternal estate of Lauriston about the planting of some cabbages. The Earl stayed for a considerable time, played a game of piquet with his countrymen, and left him, charmed with his ease, good sense, and good breeding. Among the nobles who, by means of the public credulity at this time, gained sums sufficient to repair their ruined fortunes, may be mentioned the names of the Duc de Bourbon, de Guiche, de la Force, de Chaulnay, and d'Antin, the Maréchal d'Estrées, the Prince de Rohan, de Poix, and de Léon. The Duc de Bourbon, son of Louis XVIII, by Madame de Montespan, was peculiarly fortunate in his speculations in Mississippi paper. He rebuilt the royal residence of Chantilly in a style of unwonted magnificence, and being passionately fond of horses, he erected a range of stables, which were long renowned throughout Europe, and imported 150 of the finest racers from England to improve the breed in France. He bought a large extent of country in Picardy, and became possessed of nearly all the valuable lands lying between the Oise and the Somme. When fortunes such as these were gained, it is no wonder that Law should have been almost worshipped by the mercurial population. Never was monarch more flattered than he was. All the small poets and litterateurs of the day poured floods of adulation upon him. According to them, he was the savior of the country, the tutelary divinity of France. Wit was in all his words, goodness in all his looks, and wisdom in all his actions. So great a crowd followed his carriage whenever he went abroad, that the regent sent him a troop of horse as his permanent escort to clear the streets before him. It was remarked at this time that Paris had never before been so full of objects of elegance and luxury. Statues, pictures, and tapestries were imported in great quantities from foreign countries, and found a ready market. All those pretty trifles in the way of furniture and ornament which the French excel in manufacturing were no longer the exclusive playthings of the aristocracy, but were to be found in abundance in the houses of traders, and the middle classes in general. Jewelry of the most costly description was brought to Paris as the most favorable mart. Among the rest, the famous diamond bought by the Regent, and called by his name, and which long adorned the crown of France. It was purchased for the sum of 2 millions of livres, under circumstances which show that the Regent was not so great a gainer as some of his subjects by the impetus which trade had received. When the diamond was first offered to him, he refused to buy it, although he desired above all things to possess it, alleging as his reason that his duty to the country he governed would not allow him to spend so large a sum of the public money for a mere jewel. This valid and honorable excuse threw all the ladies of the court into alarm, and nothing was heard for some days but expressions of regret that so rare a gem should be allowed to go out of France, no private individual being rich enough to buy it. The regent was continually importuned about it, but all in vain, until the Duc de Saint-Simon, who with all his ability was something of a twaddler, undertook the weighty business. His entreaties being seconded by Law, the good-natured regent gave his consent, leaving to Law's ingenuity to find the means to pay for it. The owner took security for the payment of the sum of 2 millions of livres within a stated period, receiving in the meantime the interest of 5% upon that amount, and being allowed, besides, all the valuable clippings of the gem. Saint Simon, in his memoirs, relates with no little complacency his share in this transaction. In other words, he was proud that he had induced him to sacrifice his duty and buy a bauble for himself at an extravagant price out of the public money. Thus, the system continued to flourish till the commencement of the year 1720. The warnings of the Parliament that too great a creation of paper money would, sooner or later, bring the country to bankruptcy were disregarded. The regent, who knew nothing whatever of the philosophy of finance, thought that a system which had produced such good effects could never be carried to excess. If 500 millions of paper had been of such advantage, 500 millions additional would be of still greater advantage. This was the grand error of the regent, and which Law did not attempt to dispel. The extraordinary avidity of the people kept up the delusion, and the higher the price of Indian and Mississippi stock, the more billets de bank were issued to keep pace with it. The edifice thus reared might not unaptly be compared to the gorgeous palace erected by Potemkin, that princely barbarian of Russia, to surprise and please his imperial mistress. Huge blocks of ice were piled one upon another. Ionic pillars of chastest workmanship in ice formed a noble portico, and a dome of the same material shone in the sun, which had just strength enough to gild but not to melt it. It glittered afar like a palace of crystals and diamonds, but there came one warm breeze from the south, and the stately building dissolved away, till none were able even to gather up the fragments. So with Law and his paper system. No sooner did the breath of popular mistrust blow steadily upon it, than it fell to ruins, and none could raise it up again. The first slight alarm that was occasioned was early in 1720. The Prince de Conti, offended that Law should have denied him fresh shares in India stock at his own price, sent to his bank to demand payment in specie of so enormous a quantity of notes that 3 wagons were required for its transport. Law complained to the regent and urged on his attention the mischief that would be done if such an example found many imitators. The regent was but too well aware of it, and, sending for the Prince de Conti, ordered him, under penalty of his high displeasure, to refund to the bank 2/3 of the specie which he had withdrawn from it. The prince was forced to obey the despotic mandate. Happily for Law's credit, de Conti was an unpopular man. Everybody condemned his meanness and cupidity, and agreed that Law had been hardly treated. It is strange, however, that so narrow an escape should not have made both Law and the regent more anxious to restrict their issues. Others were soon found who imitated, from motives of distrust, the example which had been set by de Conti and revenge. The more acute stock jobbers imagined justly that prices could not continue to rise forever. Bourdon and La Richardière, renowned for their extensive operations in the funds, quietly and in small quantities at a time, converted their notes into specie, and sent it away to foreign countries. They also bought as much as they could conveniently carry of plate and expensive jewelry, and sent it secretly away to England or to Holland. Vermalet, a jobber who sniffed the coming storm, procured gold and silver coin to the amount of nearly 1,000,000 of livres, which he packed in a farmer's cart and covered over with hay and cow dung. He then disguised himself in the dirty smock frock or blouse of a peasant and drove his precious load in safety into Belgium. From thence he soon found means to transport it to Amsterdam. Hitherto no difficulty had been experienced by any class in procuring specie for their wants, but this system could not long be carried on without causing a scarcity. The voice of complaint was heard on every side, and inquiries being instituted, the cause was soon discovered. The council debated long on the remedies to be taken, and Law, being called on for his advice, was of opinion that an edict should be published, depreciating the value of coin 5% below that of paper. The edict was published accordingly, But failing of its intended effect was followed by another, in which the depreciation was increased to 10%. The payments of the bank were at the same time restricted to 100 livres in gold and 10 in silver. All these measures were nugatory to restore confidence in the paper, though the restriction of cash payments within limits so extremely narrow kept up the credit of the bank. Notwithstanding every effort to the contrary, the precious metals continued to be conveyed to England and Holland. The little coin that was left in the country was carefully treasured or hidden until the scarcity became so great that the operations of trade could no longer be carried on. In this emergency, law hazarded the bold experiment of forbidding the use of specie altogether. In February 1720, an edict was published, which, instead of restoring the credit of the paper, as was intended, destroyed it irrecoverably and drove the country to the very brink of revolution. By this famous edict, it was forbidden to any person whatever to have more than 500 livres of coin in his possession, under pain of a heavy fine and confiscation of the sums found. It was also forbidden to buy up jewelry, plate, and precious stones, and informers were encouraged to make search for offenders by the promise of one-half the amount they might discover. The whole country sent up a cry of distress at this unheard-of tyranny. The most odious persecution daily took place. The privacy of families was violated by the intrusion of informers and their agents. The most virtuous and honest were denounced for the crime of having been seen with a louis d'or in their possession. Servants betrayed their masters, one citizen became a spy upon his neighbor, and arrests and confiscations so multiplied that the courts found a difficulty in getting through the immense increase of business thus occasioned. It was sufficient for an informer to say that he suspected any person of concealing money in his house, and immediately a search warrant was granted. Lord Stair, the English ambassador, said that it was now impossible to doubt of the sincerity of Law's conversion to the Catholic religion. He had established the Inquisition after having given abundant evidence of his faith in transubstantiation by turning so much gold into paper. Every epithet that popular hatred could suggest was showered upon the Regent and the unhappy Law. Coin to any amount above 500 livres was an illegal tender, and nobody would take paper if he could help it. No one knew today what his notes would be worth tomorrow. Never, says Duclos in his secret memoirs of the Regency, was seen a more capricious government. Never was a more frantic tyranny exercised by hands less firm. It is inconceivable to those who were witnesses of the horrors of those times, and who look back upon them now as on a dream, that a sudden revolution did not break out, that Law and the Regent did not perish by a tragical death. They were both held in horror, but the people confined themselves to complaints. A somber and timid despair, a stupid consternation, had seized upon all, and men's minds were too vile even to be capable of a courageous crime. It would appear that, one time, a movement of the people was organized. Seditious writings were posted up against the walls and were sent, in handbills, to the houses of the most conspicuous people. One of them, given in the Mémoires de la Régence, was to the following effect: Sir and Madam, this is to give you notice that a St. Bartholomew's Day will be enacted again on Saturday and Sunday, if affairs do not alter. You are desired not to stir out, nor you nor your servants. God preserve you from the flames. Give notice to your neighbors. Dated Saturday, May 25th, 1720. 25th. The immense number of spies with which the city was infested rendered the people mistrustful of one another, and beyond some trifling disturbances made in the evening by an insignificant group, which was soon dispersed, the peace of the capital was not compromised. The value of shares in the Louisiana or Mississippi stock had fallen very rapidly, and few indeed were found to believe the tales that had once been told of the immense wealth of that region. A last effort was therefore tried to restore the public confidence in the Mississippi project. For this purpose, a general conscription of all the poor wretches in Paris was made by order of government. Upwards of 6,000 of the very refuse of the population were impressed, as if in time of war, and were provided with clothes and tools to be embarked for New Orleans, to work in the gold mines alleged to abound there. They were paraded day after day through the streets with their pikes and shovels, and then sent off in small detachments to the outports to be shipped for America. 2/3 of them never reached their destination, but dispersed themselves over the country, sold their tools for what they could get, and returned to their old course of life. In less than 3 weeks afterwards, 1/2 of them were to be found again in Paris. The maneuver, however, caused a trifling advance in Mississippi stock. Many persons of superabundant gullibility believed that operations had begun in earnest in the new Golconda, and that gold and silver ingots would again be found in France. In a constitutional monarchy, some surer means would have been found for the restoration of public credit. In England, at a subsequent period when a similar delusion had brought on similar distress, how different were the measures taken to repair the evil? But in France, unfortunately, the remedy was left to the authors of the mischief. All payments were ordered to be made in paper, and between the 1st of February and the end of May, notes were fabricated to the amount of upwards of 1,500 millions of livres, or 60 million sterling. But the alarm once sounded, no art could make the people feel the slightest confidence in paper, which was not exchangeable into metal. Monsieur Lambert, the president of the Parliament of Paris, told the regent to his face that he would rather have 100,000 livres in gold or silver than 5 millions in the notes of his bank. When such was the general feeling, the superabundant issues of paper but increased the evil, by rendering still more enormous the disparity between the amount of specie and notes in circulation. Coin, which it was the object of the regent to depreciate, rose in value on every fresh attempt to diminish it. In February, it was judged advisable that the Royal Bank should be incorporated with the Company of the Indies. An edict to that effect was published and registered by the Parliament. The state remained the guarantee for the notes of the bank, and no more were to be issued without an order in council. All the profits of the bank, since the time it had been taken out of law's hands and made a national institution, were given over by the regent to the Company of the Indies. This measure had the effect of raising for a short time the value of the Louisiana and other shares of the company, but it failed in placing public credit on any permanent basis. A council of state was held in the beginning of May, at which Law, d'Argenson, and all the ministers were present. It was then computed that the total amount of notes in circulation was 2,600 millions of livres, while the coin in the country was not quite equal to half that amount. It was evident to the majority of the council that some plan must be adopted to equalize the currency. Some proposed that the notes should be reduced to the value of the specie, while others proposed that the nominal value of the specie should be raised till it was on an equality with the paper. Law is said to have opposed both these projects, but failing in suggesting any other, it was agreed that the notes should be depreciated one half. On the 21st of May, an edict was accordingly issued, by which it was decreed that the shares of the Company of the Indies and the notes of the bank should gradually diminish in value till at the end of a year they should only pass current for one half of their nominal worth. The Parliament refused to register the edict. The greatest outcry was excited, and the state of the country became so alarming that, as the only means of preserving tranquility, the Council of the Regency was obliged to stultify its own proceedings by publishing within 7 days another edict, restoring the notes to their original value. On the same day, the 27th of May, the bank stopped payment in specie. Law and d'Argenson were both dismissed from the ministry. The weak, vacillating, and cowardly regent threw the blame of all the mischief upon Law, who, upon presenting himself at the Palais Royal, was refused admittance. At nightfall, however, he was sent for and admitted into the palace by a secret door, when the regent endeavored to console him, and made all manner of excuses for the severity with which in public he had been compelled to treat him. So capricious was his conduct that, 2 days afterwards, he took him publicly to the opera, where he sat in the royal box alongside of the regent, who treated him with marked consideration in face of all the people. But such was the hatred against Law that the experiment had well nigh proved fatal to him. The mob assailed his carriage with stones just as he was entering his own door, and if the coachman had not made a sudden jerk into the courtyard and the domestics closed the gate immediately, he would, in all probability, have been dragged out and torn to pieces. On the following day, his wife and daughter were also assailed by the mob as they were returning in their carriage from the races. When the regent was informed of these occurrences, he sent Law a strong detachment of Swiss guards who were stationed night and day in the court of his residence. The public indignation at last increased so much that Law, finding his own house, even with this guard, insecure, took refuge in the Palais Royal, in the apartments of the regent. The Chancellor d'Aguesseau, who had been dismissed in 1718 for his opposition to the projects of Law, was now recalled to aid in the restoration of credit. The regent acknowledged too late that he had treated with unjustifiable harshness and mistrust one of the ablest and perhaps the sole honest public man of that corrupt period. He had retired ever since his disgrace to his country house at Frayne, where, in the midst of severe but delightful philosophic studies, he had forgotten the intrigues of an unworthy court. Law himself and the Chevalier de Conflans, a gentleman of the regent's household, were dispatched in a post-chaise with orders to bring the ex-chancellor to Paris along with them. D'Aguesseau consented to render what assistance he could, contrary to the advice of his friends, who did not approve that he should accept any recall to office of which Law was the bearer. On his arrival in Paris, 5 councillors of the Parliament were admitted to confer with the Commissary of Finance. And on the 1st of June, an order was published abolishing the law, which made it criminal to amass coin to the amount of more than 500 livres. Everyone was permitted to have as much specie as he pleased. In order that the banknotes might be withdrawn, 25 millions of new notes were created, on the security of the revenues of the city of Paris, at 2.5%. The banknotes withdrawn were publicly burned in front of the Hôtel de Ville. The new notes were principally of the value of 10 livres each, and on the 10th of June the bank was reopened with a sufficiency of silver coin to give in change for them. These measures were productive of considerable advantage. All the population of Paris hastened to the bank to get coin for their small notes, and silver becoming scarce, they were paid in copper. Very few complained that this was too heavy, although poor fellows might be continually seen toiling and sweating along the streets, laden with more than they could comfortably carry, in the shape of change for 50 livres. The crowds around the bank were so great that hardly a day passed that someone was not pressed to death. On the 9th of July, the multitude was so dense and clamorous that the guards stationed at the entrance of the Mazarin Gardens closed the gate and refused to admit any more. The crowd became incensed and flung stones through the railings upon the soldiers. The latter, incensed in their turn, threatened to fire upon the people. At that instant, one of them was hit by a stone, and taking up his piece, he fired into the crowd. One man fell dead immediately, and another was severely wounded. It was every instant expected that a general attack would have been commenced upon the bank, but the gates of the Mazarin Gardens being opened to the crowd, who saw a whole troop of soldiers with their bayonets fixed ready to receive them, they contented themselves by giving vent to their indignation in groans and hisses. 8 days afterwards, the concourse of people was so tremendous that 15 persons were squeezed to death at the doors of the bank. The people were so indignant that they took 3 of the bodies on stretchers before them, and proceeded to the number of 7 or 8,000 to the gardens of the Palais Royal, that they might show the Regent the misfortunes that he and Law had brought upon the country. Law's coachman, who was sitting at the box of his master's carriage in the courtyard of the palace, happened to have more zeal than discretion, and, not liking that the mob should abuse his master, he said, loud enough to be overheard by several persons, that they were all blackguards and deserved to be hanged. The mob immediately set upon him, and thinking that Law was in the carriage, broke it to pieces. The imprudent coachman narrowly escaped with his life. No further mischief was done. A body of troops making their appearance, the crowd quietly dispersed after an assurance had been given by the Regent that the 3 bodies they had brought to show him should be decently buried at his own expense. The Parliament was sitting at the time of this uproar, and the President took upon himself to go out and see what was the matter. On his return, he informed the councillors that Law's carriage had been broken by the mob. All the members rose simultaneously and expressed their joy by a loud shout, while one man, more zealous in his hatred than the rest, exclaimed, "And Law himself, is he torn to pieces?" Much undoubtedly depended on the credit of the Company of the Indies, which was answerable for so great a sum to the nation. It was therefore suggested in the Council of the Ministry that any privileges which could be granted to enable it to fulfill its engagements would be productive of the best results. With this end in view, it was proposed that the exclusive privilege of all maritime commerce should be secured to it, and an edict to that effect was published. But it was unfortunately forgotten that by such a measure all the merchants of the country would be ruined. The idea of such an immense privilege was generally scouted by the nation, and petition on petition was presented to the Parliament that they would refuse to register the decree. They refused accordingly, and the Regent, remarking that they did nothing but fan the flame of sedition, exiled them to Blois. At the intercession of D'Aguesseau, the place of banishment was changed to Pontoise, and thither accordingly the councillors repaired, determined to set the Regent at defiance. They made every arrangement for rendering their temporary exile as agreeable as possible. The President gave the most elegant suppers, to which he invited all the gayest and wittiest company of Paris. Every night there was a concert and ball for the ladies. The usually grave and solemn judges and councillors joined in cards and other diversions, leading for several weeks a life of the most extravagant pleasure, for no other purpose than to show the Regent of how little consequence they deemed their banishment, and that when they willed it, they could make Pontoise a pleasanter residence than Paris. Of all the nations in the world, the French are the most renowned for singing over their grievances. Of that country it has been remarked with some truth, that its whole history may be traced in its songs. When Law, by the utter failure of his best-laid plans, rendered himself obnoxious, satire of course seized hold upon him, and while caricatures of his person appeared in all the shops, the streets resounded with songs, in which neither he nor the Regent was spared. Many of these songs were far from decent, and one of them in particular counseled the application of all his notes to the most ignoble use to which paper can be applied. But the following, preserved in the letters of the Duchess of Orleans, was the best and the most popular, and was to be heard for months in all the carrefours in Paris. Among the caricatures that were abundantly published, and that showed as plainly as graver matters that the nation had awakened to a sense of its folly, was one, a facsimile of which is preserved in the Mémoires de la Régence. It was thus described by its author: the goddess of shares in her triumphal car, driven by the goddess of folly. Those who are drawing the car are impersonations of the Mississippi, with his wooden leg, the South Sea, the Bank of England, the Company of the West of Senegal, and of various assurances. Lest the car should not roll fast enough, the agents of these companies, known by their long foxtails and their cunning looks, turn round the spokes of the wheels, upon which are marked the names of the several stocks and their value, sometimes high and sometimes low according to the turns of the wheel. Upon the ground are the merchandise, day-books, and ledgers of legitimate commerce, crushed under the chariot of folly. Behind is an immense crowd of persons of all ages, sexes, and conditions, clamoring after fortune and fighting with each other to get a portion of the shares which she distributes so bountifully among them. In the cloud sits a demon, blowing bubbles of soap, which are also the objects of the admiration and cupidity of the crowd, who jump upon one another's backs to reach them ere they burst. Right in the pathway of the car and blocking up the passage stands a large building with 3 doors, through one of which it must pass if it proceeds farther, and all the crowd along with it. Over the first door are the words Hôpital des Fous, over the second, Hôpital des Malades, and over the third, Hôpital des Gueux. Another caricature represented Law sitting in a large cauldron, boiling over the flames of popular madness, surrounded by an impetuous multitude who were pouring all their gold and silver into it, and receiving gladly in exchange the bits of paper which he distributed among them by handfuls. While this excitement lasted, Law took good care not to expose himself unguarded in the streets. Shut up in the apartments of the Regent, he was secure from all attack, and whenever he ventured abroad it was either incognito or in one of the royal carriages with a powerful escort. An amusing anecdote is recorded of the detestation in which he was held by the people, and the ill treatment he would have met had he fallen into their hands. A gentleman of the name of Bourcel was passing in his carriage down the Rue Saint-Antoine when his farther progress was stayed by a hackney coach that had blocked up the road. Monsieur Bourcel's servant called impatiently to the hackney coachman to get out of the way, and on his refusal struck him a blow on the face. A crowd was soon drawn together by the disturbance, and Monsieur Bourcel got out of the carriage to restore order. The hackney coachman, imagining that he had now another assailant, bethought him of an expedient to rid himself of both, and called out as loudly as he was able, "Help! Help! Murder! Murder! Here are Law and his servant going to kill me! Help! Help!" At this cry the people came out of their shops, armed with sticks and other weapons, while the mob gathered stones to inflict summary vengeance upon the supposed financier. Happily for Monsieur Bourcel and his servant, the door of the church of the Jesuits stood wide open, and seeing the fearful odds against them, they rushed towards it with all speed. They reached the altar, pursued by the people, and would have been ill-treated even there, if, finding the door open, leading to the sacristy, they had not sprang through and closed it after them. The mob were then persuaded to leave the church by the alarmed and indignant priests, and finding Monsieur Bourcel's carriage still in the streets, they vented their ill will against it and did it considerable damage. The 25 millions secured on the municipal revenues of the city of Paris, bearing so low an interest as 2.5%, were not very popular among the large holders of Mississippi stock. The conversion of the securities was therefore a work of considerable difficulty, for many preferred to retain the falling paper of Law's company, in the hope that a favorable turn might take place. On the 15th of August, with a view to hasten the conversion, an edict was passed declaring that all notes for sums between 1,000 and 10,000 livres should not pass current, except for the purchase of annuities and bank accounts, or for the payment of installments still due on the shares of the company. In October, following another edict was passed, depriving these notes of all value whatever after the month of November next ensuing. The management of the mint, the farming of the revenue, and all the other advantages and privileges of the India or Mississippi Company were taken from them, and they were reduced to a mere private company. This was the death blow to the whole system, which had now got into the hands of its enemies. Law had lost all influence in the Council of Finance, and the company, being despoiled of its immunities, could no longer hold out the shadow of a prospect of being able to fulfill its engagements. All those suspected of illegal profits at the time the public delusion was at its height were sought out and immersed in heavy fines. It was previously ordered that a list of the original proprietors should be made out, and that such persons as still retained their shares should place them in deposit with the company, and that those who had neglected to complete the shares for which they had put down their names should now purchase them of the company at the rate of 13,500 livres for each share of 500 livres. Rather than submit to pay this enormous sum for stock, which was actually at a discount, the shareholders packed up all their portable effects and endeavored to find a refuge in foreign countries. Orders were immediately issued to the authorities at the ports and frontiers to apprehend all travelers who sought to leave the kingdom and keep them in custody until it was ascertained whether they had any plate or jewelry with them or were concerned in the late stock jobbing. Against such few as escaped, the punishment of death was recorded, while the most arbitrary proceedings were instituted against those who remained. Law himself, in a moment of despair, determined to leave a country where his life was no longer secure. He at first only demanded permission to retire from Paris to one of his country seats, a permission which the Regent cheerfully granted. The latter was much affected at the unhappy turn affairs had taken, but his faith continued unmoved in the truth and efficacy of Law's financial system. His eyes were opened to his own errors, and during the few remaining years of his life he constantly longed for an opportunity of again establishing the system upon a securer basis. At Law's last interview with the prince, he is reported to have said, "I confess that I have committed many faults. I committed them because I am a man, and all men are liable to error. But I declare to you most solemnly that none of them proceeded from wicked or dishonest motives, and that nothing of the kind will be found in the whole course of my conduct." 2 or 3 days after his departure, the regent sent him a very kind letter, permitting him to leave the kingdom whenever he pleased, and stating that he had ordered his passports to be made ready. He at the same time offered him any sum of money he might require. Law respectfully declined the money and set out for Brussels in a post-chaise belonging to Madame de Prie, the mistress of the Duke of Bourbon, escorted by 6 horse guards. From thence he proceeded to Venice, where he remained for some months, the object of the greatest curiosity to the people who believed him to be the possessor of enormous wealth. No opinion, however, could be more erroneous. With more generosity than could have been expected from a man who during the greatest part of his life had been a professed gambler, he had refused to enrich himself at the expense of a ruined nation. During the height of the popular frenzy for Mississippi stock, he had never doubted of the final success of his projects in making France the richest and most powerful nation of Europe. He invested all his gains in the purchase of landed property in France, a sure proof of his own belief in the stability of his schemes. He had hoarded no plate or jewelry and sent no money, like the dishonest jobbers, to foreign countries. His all, with the exception of 1 diamond, worth about 5,000 or 6,000 pounds sterling, was invested in the French soil, and when he left that country, he left it almost a beggar. This fact alone ought to rescue his memory from the charge of knavery, so often and so unjustly brought against him. As soon as his departure was known, all his estates and his valuable library were confiscated. Among the rest, an annuity of 200,000 livres, 8,000 sterling, on the lives of his wife and children, which had been purchased for 5 millions of livres, was forfeited, notwithstanding that a special edict, drawn up for the purpose in the days of his prosperity, had expressly declared that it should never be confiscated for any cause whatever. Great discontent existed among the people that Law had been suffered to escape. The mob and the Parliament would have been pleased to have seen him hanged. The few who had not suffered by the commercial revolution rejoiced that the quack had left the country. But all those, and they were by far the most numerous class, whose fortunes were implicated, regretted that his intimate knowledge of the distress of the country and of the causes that had led to it had not been rendered more available in discovering a remedy. At a meeting of the Council of Finance and the General Council of the Regency, documents were laid upon the table from which it appeared that the amount of notes in circulation was 2,700 millions. The Regent was called upon to explain how it happened that there was a discrepancy between the dates at which these issues were made and those of the edicts by which they were authorized. He might have safely taken the whole blame upon himself, but he preferred that an absent man should bear a share of it, and he therefore stated that Law, upon his own authority, had issued 1,200 millions of notes at different times, and that he, the regent, seeing that the thing had been irrevocably done, had screened Law by antedating the decrees of the council which authorized the augmentation. It would have been more to his credit if he had told the whole truth while he was about it, and acknowledged that it was mainly through his extravagance and impatience that Law had been induced to overstep the bounds of safe speculation. It was also ascertained that the national debt, on the 1st of January 1721, amounted to upwards of 3,100 millions of livres, or more than 124 million sterling, the interest upon which was over 3 millions. A commission or visa was forthwith appointed to examine into all the securities of the state creditors, who were to be divided into 5 classes. The first 4 comprising those who had purchased their securities with real effects, and the latter comprising those who could give no proofs that the transactions they had entered into were real and bona fide. The securities of the latter were ordered to be destroyed, while those of the first 4 classes were subjected to a most rigid and jealous scrutiny. The result of the labors of the visa was a report, in which they counseled the reduction of the interest upon these securities to 56 millions of livres. They justified this advice by a statement of the various acts of peculation and extortion which they had discovered, and an edict to that effect was accordingly published and duly registered by the parliaments of the kingdom. Another tribunal was afterwards established under the title of the Chambre de l'Arsenal, which took cognizance of all the malversations committed in the financial departments of the government during the late unhappy period. A master of requests named Fallonet, together with the Abbé Clément, and 2 clerks in their employ, had been concerned in divers acts of peculation to the amount of upwards of 1,000,000 of livres. The first 2 were sentenced to be beheaded, and the latter to be hanged, but their punishment was afterwards commuted into imprisonment for life in the Bastille. Numerous other acts of dishonesty were discovered and punished by fine and imprisonment. D'Argenson shared with Law and the Regent the unpopularity which had alighted upon all those concerned in the Mississippi madness. He was dismissed from his post of chancellor to make room for D'Aguesseau, but he retained the title of Keeper of the Seals and was allowed to attend the councils whenever he pleased. He thought it better, however, to withdraw from Paris and live for a time a life of seclusion at his country seat. But he was not formed for retirement, and becoming moody and discontented, he aggravated a disease under which he had long labored, and died in less than a 12-month. The populace of Paris so detested him that they carried their hatred even to his grave. As his funeral procession passed to the church of St. Nicholas du Chardonneret, the burying place of his family, it was beset by a riotous mob, and his 2 sons, who were following as chief mourners, were obliged to drive as fast as they were able down a by-street to escape personal violence. As regards Law, he for some time entertained a hope that he should be recalled to France, to aid in establishing its credit upon a firmer basis. The death of the Regent in 1723, who expired suddenly as he was sitting by the fireside, conversing with his mistress, the Duchess de Phalaris, deprived him of that hope, and he was reduced to lead his former life of gambling. He was more than once obliged to pawn his diamond, the sole remnant of his vast wealth, but successful play generally enabled him to redeem it. Being persecuted by his creditors at Rome, he proceeded to Copenhagen, where he received permission from the English ministry to reside in his native country, his pardon for the murder of Mr. Wilson having been sent over to him in 1719. He was brought over in the admiral's ship, a circumstance which gave occasion for a short debate in the House of Lords. Earl Coningsby complained that a man who had renounced both his country and his religion should have been treated with such honor, and expressed his belief that his presence in England, at a time when the people were so bewildered by the nefarious practices of the South Sea directors, would be attended with no little danger. He gave notice of a motion on the subject, but it was allowed to drop, no other member of the House having the slightest participation in his lordship's fears. Law remained for about 4 years in England and then proceeded to Venice, where he died in 1729, in very embarrassed circumstances. His brother, William Law, who had been concerned with him in the administration, both of the bank and the Louisiana Company, was imprisoned in the Bastille for alleged malversation, but no guilt was ever proved against him. He was liberated after 15 months and became the founder of a family which is still known in France under the title of Marquis of Lauriston. In the next chapter will be found an account of the madness which infected the people of England at the same time, and under very similar circumstances, but which, thanks to the energies and good sense of a constitutional government, was attended with results far less disastrous than those which were seen in France. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want to go deep down into the rabbit hole of marketing and persuasion, click the link in the description where you will find many fundamental books about copywriting, psychology, and persuasion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. See you in the next one.